The air hung thick with the smell of diesel and burnt cordite, a metallic tang that coated the throat and lingered in the lungs. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann steadied his binoculars against the rim of his Panther tank's cupola, scanning the tree line where intelligence reports had indicated American armor movements. The sun slanted low across the Norman hedgerows, casting long shadows that turned the pastoral countryside into a maze of dark corridors and bright exposures. His crew had been at their station since dawn, waiting, watching, conserving the precious fuel that had become scarcer with each passing week. Through the magnified lens, Hoffman caught movement. Armor, definitely armor, emerging from behind a stone farmhouse that had been reduced to skeletal walls by artillery fire. But as the vehicle rolled into clearer view, he felt a moment of profound confusion. The silhouette was unmistakably a Sherman, that blocky, ungainly American medium tank that German crews had learned to regard with a mixture of contempt and relief. Contempt because the Sherman was mechanically simple, tactically predictable, and woefully undergunned compared to German designs. Relief because it meant the engagement would likely favor the superior German armor. But this Sherman was wrong. Its hull was obscured by what appeared to be thick, irregular padding that covered the front glacis, the turret sides, even portions of the sponsons. As Hoffman adjusted focus, he realized with growing disbelief that the padding was composed of sandbags, dozens upon dozens of burlap sacks filled with earth and stone, lashed to the tank's armor with rope and wire in layered configurations that gave the vehicle a strangely organic, improvised appearance. Behind this first Sherman came another, similarly modified, and then a third. An entire platoon of Shermans, each one wearing what could only be described as a coat of dirt. Hoffman lowered his binoculars slowly, his mind racing through the tactical implications. German tank doctrine, refined through years of mechanized warfare across Poland, France, Russia, and now France again, emphasized the absolute primacy of armor thickness and gun caliber. The Panther he commanded mounted an 75mm KWK 42L70 gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, protected by frontal armor that measured 80mm at its thickest points, sloped at angles that effectively doubled its protective value. This combination of firepower and protection had made the Panther arguably the finest medium tank in the world by late 1944, a weapon system that represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering philosophy. Tanks were supposed to be precision instruments, carefully calculated machines where every millimeter of armor plating was the result of metallurgical expertise, stress analysis, and industrial sophistication. The idea that simple burlap sacks filled with common earth could meaningfully contribute to a tank's defensive capability seemed to violate every principle of armored warfare that Hoffman had been taught at the Panzer schools. It was crude. It was primitive. It was the kind of desperate field expedient one might expect from partisans or colonial troops, not from the mechanized forces of an industrial superpower. And yet, as those Shermans advanced across the open ground toward German positions, Hoffman felt an uncomfortable twinge of uncertainty. The Americans would not have applied such modifications without reason. They were not stupid, however much German propaganda might suggest otherwise. If they believed sandbags offered protection, they had presumably tested the concept or learned its value through bitter experience. The German military mind, conditioned by Prussian tradition and refined through decades of professional development, operated according to certain fundamental assumptions about warfare. Chief among these was the belief that military effectiveness derived from superior training, superior equipment, and superior tactical doctrine applied with disciplined precision. German officers were taught to analyze problems systematically, to identify optimal solutions through rigorous intellectual process, and to execute those solutions with mechanical efficiency. This approach had served Germany extraordinarily well in the early years of the war, when German forces had consistently outmaneuvered and outfought numerically superior opponents through superior coordination and tactical flexibility. But it also created certain blind spots, certain assumptions about how war should be fought, that did not always align with how war was actually being fought by 1944. The American approach to armored warfare, as German intelligence officers had documented with growing concern throughout the campaign in France, was fundamentally different from the German model. The air hung thick with the smell of diesel and burnt cordite, a metallic tang that coated the throat and lingered in the lungs. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann steadied his binoculars against the rim of his Panther tank's cupola, scanning the tree line where intelligence reports had indicated American armor movements. The sun slanted low across the Norman hedgerows, casting long shadows that turned the pastoral countryside into a maze of dark corridors and bright exposures. His crew had been at their station since dawn, waiting, watching, conserving the precious fuel that had become scarcer with each passing week. Through the magnified lens, Hoffman caught movement. Armor, definitely armor, emerging from behind a stone farmhouse that had been reduced to skeletal walls by artillery fire. But as the vehicle rolled into clearer view, he felt a moment of profound confusion. The silhouette was unmistakably a Sherman, that blocky, ungainly American medium tank that German crews had learned to regard with a mixture of contempt and relief. Contempt because the Sherman was mechanically simple, tactically predictable, and woefully undergunned compared to German designs. Relief because it meant the engagement would likely favor the superior German armor. But this Sherman was wrong. Its hull was obscured by what appeared to be thick, irregular padding that covered the front glacis, the turret sides, even portions of the sponsons. As Hoffman adjusted focus, he realized with growing disbelief that the padding was composed of sandbags, dozens upon dozens of burlap sacks filled with earth and stone, lashed to the tank's armor with rope and wire in layered configurations that gave the vehicle a strangely organic, improvised appearance. Behind this first Sherman came another, similarly modified, and then a third. An entire platoon of Shermans, each one wearing what could only be described as a coat of dirt. Hoffman lowered his binoculars slowly, his mind racing through the tactical implications. German tank doctrine, refined through years of mechanized warfare across Poland, France, Russia, and now France again, emphasized the absolute primacy of armor thickness and gun caliber. The Panther he commanded mounted a 75mm KWK 42L70 gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, protected by frontal armor that measured 80mm at its thickest points, sloped at angles that effectively doubled its protective value. This combination of firepower and protection had made the Panther arguably the finest medium tank in the world by late 1944, a weapon system that represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering philosophy. Tanks were supposed to be precision instruments, carefully calculated machines where every millimeter of armor plating was the result of metallurgical expertise, stress analysis, and industrial sophistication. The idea that simple burlap sacks filled with common earth could meaningfully contribute to a tank's defensive capability seemed to violate every principle of armored warfare that Hoffman had been taught at the Panzer schools. It was crude. It was primitive. It was the kind of desperate field expedient one might expect from partisans or colonial troops, not from the mechanized forces of an industrial superpower. And yet, as those Shermans advanced across the open ground toward German positions, Hoffman felt an uncomfortable twinge of uncertainty. The Americans would not have applied such modifications without reason. They were not stupid, however much German propaganda might suggest otherwise. If they believed sandbags offered protection, they had presumably tested the concept or learned its value through bitter experience. The German military mind, conditioned by Prussian tradition and refined through decades of professional development, operated according to certain fundamental assumptions about warfare. Chief among these was the belief that military effectiveness derived from superior training, superior equipment, and superior tactical doctrine applied with disciplined precision. German officers were taught to analyze problems systematically, to identify optimal solutions through rigorous intellectual process, and to execute those solutions with mechanical efficiency. This approach had served Germany extraordinarily well in the early years of the war, when German forces had consistently outmaneuvered and outfought numerically superior opponents through superior coordination and tactical flexibility. But it also created certain blind spots, certain assumptions about how war should be fought, that did not always align with how war was actually being fought by 1944. The American approach to armored warfare, as German intelligence officers had documented with growing concern throughout the campaign in France, was fundamentally different from the German model. By late August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began the rapid pursuit across France, the practice of sandbag armoring had become widespread enough to attract official attention. Army ordnance officers, concerned about the potential for the additional weight to damage suspension systems and overburden engines, began conducting field surveys to assess the practice. What they found was a complex picture. Some applications were clearly excessive, with crews piling sandbags so thickly that tanks became dangerously overloaded and mechanically unreliable. Other applications appeared more thoughtful, with sandbags applied selectively to areas identified as particularly vulnerable. The ordnance officers faced a dilemma. On one hand, the sandbag modifications were unauthorized field expedients that violated maintenance protocols and complicated logistics. On the other hand, the modifications were being applied by the crews who actually fought in the tanks, who presumably had better practical understanding of combat vulnerabilities than rear echelon experts. After considerable debate, Army policy settled on a compromise. Sandbag armor would not be officially endorsed, but neither would it be explicitly forbidden. Crews would be warned about the mechanical risks of overloading, but would be permitted to continue the practice at their own discretion. The technical effectiveness of sandbag armor was, from a purely engineering standpoint, highly variable and difficult to quantify. Against kinetic energy penetrators, solid shot, or armor-piercing projectiles that relied on velocity and mass to punch through armor plate, sandbags offered minimal protection. The sand would absorb some energy, might deflect or destabilize a projectile slightly, but could not meaningfully stop a high-velocity anti-tank round. Against shape-charged warheads, however, the type used in German Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck rockets, as well as in some anti-tank gun ammunition, sandbags could potentially offer significant protection. Shape-charged weapons functioned by creating a focused jet of superheated metal that burned through armor plate like a cutting torch. The jet's penetrating power was maximized when the warhead detonated at a specific standoff distance from the target armor, allowing the jet to form properly and concentrate its energy into a narrow penetration cone. If the warhead detonated too close to the target or against an intervening obstacle, the jet would not form correctly and penetration would be significantly reduced. Sandbags, particularly when applied in thick layers that created substantial standoff distance, could cause shape-charged warheads to detonate prematurely, dissipating their penetrating energy before the jet reached the tank's actual armor plate. The problem was that this protection was inconsistent and unpredictable. A Panzerfaust striking a sandbag barrier at the right angle and depth might detonate prematurely and fail to penetrate. The same weapon striking at a slightly different angle or impacting a thinner section of sandbag coverage might reach the armor plate and penetrate normally. There was no reliable way to predict outcomes, no mathematical formula that could guarantee protection. This uncertainty was deeply unsettling to German crews like Hoffmann's, who had been trained to think of armor protection in terms of absolute values: millimeters of steel plate, angles of deflection, calculated probabilities of penetration at given ranges. The idea that protection might be provided by something as variable and unmilitary as bags of dirt contradicted their entire conceptual framework for understanding armored combat. It suggested that warfare was less deterministic, less predictable, less subject to scientific analysis than German doctrine assumed. And that suggestion, even more than the tactical threat posed by the sandbags themselves, was what made the modification so psychologically unsettling to German crews encountering it for the first time. Hoffmann watched the sandbagged Shermans continue their advance, their commanders visible in open turrets, scanning for targets with the casual alertness of men who had survived enough battles to develop professional confidence. The lead Sherman was perhaps 800 meters distant now, well within effective range of the Panther's gun. Hoffmann gave quiet orders to his gunner, who traversed the turret smoothly and settled the crosshairs on the approaching target. The range was calculated, the ammunition was loaded, armor-piercing, capable of penetrating any Sherman at this distance regardless of sandbag modifications. Hoffmann's hand hovered over the firing mechanism, but he hesitated. The tactical situation suggested caution. There were at least 3 Shermans visible, possibly more concealed in the tree line. Opening fire would reveal the Panther's position and invite immediate return fire from superior numbers. German doctrine emphasized the importance of first-shot kills when outnumbered, but also emphasized the importance of choosing engagement conditions that favored German advantages in range and protection. At 800 meters, the Panther could kill Shermans with confidence, but at 800 meters, the Shermans could also potentially score hits on the Panther, and while their 75mm guns were unlikely to penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at that range, a lucky shot to a vision port, a gun mantlet, or a track could disable the vehicle or kill crew members. The sandbags complicated this calculation. If they provided even marginal protection against the Panther's gun, if they somehow disrupted the armor-piercing round's penetration, or caused premature detonation of explosive filler, then the Germans' advantage in firepower was reduced. Hoffmann did not believe sandbags could actually stop a 75mm armor-piercing round traveling at nearly 1,000 meters per second. Physics did not work that way, but the uncertainty itself was tactically significant. If he fired and failed to achieve an immediate kill, if the sandbags provided enough protection to allow the Sherman to survive the first hit and return fire, then the tactical advantage would shift to the Americans through sheer weight of numbers. 3 Shermans, even wounded Shermans, could overwhelm a single Panther through volume of fire if they could close the range or flank the German position. The sandbags, whether they actually worked or not, created doubt. And doubt in armored combat, where split-second decisions often determine survival, was itself a form of protection. The American crews who had pioneered the sandbag modification understood this psychological dimension instinctively, though few would have articulated it in such terms. They knew from experience that German tanks had superior guns and armor, knew that a one-on-one duel between a Sherman and a Panther or Tiger usually favored the German vehicle. But they also knew that Americans rarely fought one-on-one, that American tactical doctrine emphasized numerical superiority and mutual support, and that the goal was not to beat German tanks in fair fights, but to create conditions where fights were inherently unfair in the Americans' favor. The sandbags were part of that approach. They might provide actual physical protection in some circumstances, but more importantly, they provided psychological protection. The sense that the crew had done something to improve their chances, that they were not simply passive victims waiting to be killed, that they had agency and control over their own survival. This sense of control, even if partly illusory, was invaluable for maintaining morale and aggressive tactical behavior in an environment where caution could be as fatal as recklessness. German intelligence reports from the autumn of 1944 documented the spread of sandbag armor modifications across American armored units with a mixture of technical curiosity and strategic concern. Captured American maintenance logs showed that some units were applying sandbags systematically to entire companies of tanks, suggesting that the practice had moved beyond individual crew initiative to become something approaching standard procedure. Interrogations of captured American tank crewmen revealed that the modifications were popular among the troops, who believed, accurately or not, that the sandbags provided meaningful protection and improved survival rates. More troubling from the German perspective were reports indicating that American crews who applied sandbag armor demonstrated more aggressive tactical behavior, presumably because they felt better protected and were therefore more willing to take risks. If the sandbags were making American crews more aggressive, then the modifications were tactically significant, even if their physical protection was minimal. Aggressive tank crews seized advantageous positions, pressed attacks that forced defenders to withdraw, and created the kind of tactical momentum that could cascade into operational success. The symbolism of the sandbags extended beyond their immediate tactical function to represent something larger about the American approach to warfare. Germans looking at those dirt-covered Shermans saw crude improvisation, saw desperation, saw the kind of field expedient that soldiers resorted to when proper equipment was unavailable. But what they were actually seeing was a different kind of military effectiveness, an effectiveness rooted not in engineering perfection but in adaptive pragmatism, not in centralized planning, but in decentralized initiative, not in doing things the right way, but in doing whatever worked. The American military system, for all its faults and inefficiencies, excelled at incorporating lessons from combat experience and disseminating practical knowledge through informal channels. A successful modification developed by one crew and one battalion would spread throughout the division within days, not through official directives, but through soldier-to-soldier communication. This kind of bottom-up innovation was foreign to the German military tradition, which emphasized top-down control and standardization. German crews would not have considered modifying their vehicles without authorization, would have viewed such modifications as breaches of discipline and proper military order. American crews modified their vehicles constantly, and American officers generally tolerated or even encouraged such modifications if they seemed to work. By September 1944, when Hoffman watched those sandbagged Shermans advance across the Norman countryside, the practice had become common enough that German crews had developed their own counter-tactics. Some German gunners began deliberately targeting the sandbag arrays with high explosive rounds, hoping to blast away the protective covering before engaging with armor-piercing ammunition. Others tried to avoid hitting the sandbags entirely, aiming for exposed portions of the tank's hull or turret where no sandbag protection had been applied. Still others simply fired armor-piercing rounds at the center mass of the target, trusting that the superior penetrating power of German guns would overcome any protection the sandbags might provide. None of these approaches were fully satisfactory, and all required split-second tactical decisions in combat conditions where there was rarely time for careful deliberation. The sandbags, in effect, complicated German gunnery and forced German crews to think harder about shot placement, which consumed mental bandwidth that might otherwise have been devoted to situational awareness or tactical positioning. The weight penalty imposed by sandbag armor was substantial and created real mechanical problems for the Sherman tanks that carried them. A single sandbag, when filled with earth or sand, weighed approximately 20 to 30 kilograms depending on its size and the density of the fill material. A comprehensive sandbag armor application might involve 50 to 100 bags distributed across the tank's frontal arc, turret, and vulnerable side areas. This translated to an additional weight burden of 1,000 to 3,000 kilograms. Between 1 and 3 metric tons added to a vehicle that already weighed approximately 30 tons in standard configuration. This additional weight stressed the Sherman suspension system, which had been designed with specific load tolerances that the sandbag modifications exceeded. Crews reported increased suspension failures, particularly to the vertical volute spring suspension bogies that supported the tank's weight and absorbed shock during movement. The additional weight also burdened the engine.
A Continental R975 radial engine that produced 400 horsepower in standard configuration. While adequate for the Sherman's original design weight, the engine struggled with the overloaded vehicles, leading to higher operating temperatures, increased fuel consumption, and greater mechanical wear. American maintenance officers documented these problems meticulously, compiling data on mechanical failure rates and attempting to quantify the costs of the sandbag modifications against their benefits. The calculations were complex and the conclusions were ambiguous. Yes, the sandbags caused increased mechanical failures. Yes, they reduced operational range due to higher fuel consumption. Yes, they made the tank slower and less maneuverable. But the crews insisted that the modifications improved survival rates, and keeping experienced crews alive was valuable. A dead crew could not fight. A broken suspension could be repaired. The cold calculus suggested that the modifications were worth the mechanical costs, at least in the specific tactical environment of close-range combat in restricted terrain, where the risks of ambush were high and engagement ranges were short. In more open terrain, where engagement ranges were longer and mobility was more important, the sandbags were less valuable and sometimes counterproductive. American units adapted accordingly, applying sandbag armor heavily in urban and bocage environments, removing it for operations in open country. This kind of situational adaptation, modifying equipment to match tactical circumstances rather than maintaining standard configurations regardless of conditions, was characteristically American and reflected a pragmatic flexibility that German doctrine struggled to emulate. Hoffmann's gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, had settled his sights on the lead Sherman and was waiting for the firing command. Schmidt was an experienced gunner who had served with the division since the invasion of France in 1940, had fought in Russia during the terrible winters of 1941 and 1942, and had survived encounters with Soviet T-34s, KV-1s, and the monstrous IS-2 heavy tanks that had appeared on the Eastern Front in 1944. He had learned his craft through hundreds of engagements, had developed an almost instinctive sense for lead, range, and shot placement. But now, facing these sandbag Shermans, he felt uncharacteristic hesitation. "Where do I aim?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty unusual for a veteran gunner. "Center mass," Hoffmann replied, trying to project confidence he did not entirely feel. "The sandbags will not stop our gun." Schmidt nodded and refined his aim. But both men knew they were operating on assumption rather than knowledge. Neither had ever fired at a sandbag tank before. Neither knew with certainty what would happen when their armor-piercing round struck those irregular surfaces of burlap and earth. The moment crystallized something that had been building in German consciousness throughout 1944, a gradual recognition that the war was no longer proceeding according to familiar patterns, that the enemy was adapting faster than German forces could counter-adapt, that material advantages were beginning to overwhelm German advantages in training and tactical sophistication. The sandbags were a small thing, almost trivial in isolation, but they were part of a larger pattern that included American numerical superiority in tanks, aircraft and artillery, ammunition, and spare parts. American industrial superiority that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. And American tactical adaptability that continuously incorporated lessons from combat experience. German forces, by contrast, were fighting with dwindling resources, increasingly inadequate logistics, and a tactical doctrine that had changed little since 1941. The gap was widening, and soldiers like Hoffmann could feel it in their bones even if they could not articulate it clearly. The Americans had developed the sandbag modification because they had the resources to experiment with improvised solutions. Because their logistical system could support the additional weight and maintenance burden, because their organizational culture permitted and even encouraged soldier initiative, and because they could afford to accept imperfect solutions that provided marginal improvements rather than waiting for perfect solutions that might never arrive. This approach was fundamentally different from the German method, which emphasized careful planning, centralized decision-making, and the pursuit of optimal solutions even when such pursuit delayed implementation. The German approach had significant advantages. It produced excellent equipment and sophisticated tactics when time and resources permitted proper development. But by late 1944, time and resources were precisely what Germany lacked. The Americans, fighting from abundance, could afford to be wasteful, could afford to try multiple approaches simultaneously, could afford to implement marginal improvements immediately rather than waiting for optimal solutions. The sandbags epitomized this philosophy. They were not the best possible solution to the problem of inadequate armor, but they were a solution that could be implemented immediately using readily available materials. And immediate imperfect solutions were more valuable than theoretical perfect solutions that would never be implemented. Hoffmann gave the firing order. The Panther's gun fired with a sharp crack that reverberated across the countryside, the recoil rocking the entire tank backward against its suspension. Through the optical sight, Hoffmann watched the tracer element of the armor-piercing round streak toward the target. A line of light connecting predator to prey. The round struck the lead Sherman on the front glacis, slightly left of center, impacting directly into the sandbag covering. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the sandbags erupted outward in a shower of dirt and torn burlap. the kinetic energy of the impact vaporizing the fill material and shredding the fabric. But when the dust cleared, the Sherman was still moving, still operational, its engine still running and its guns still traversing toward the German position. Hoffman felt his stomach tighten. The round had struck solidly, should have penetrated, should have killed the crew and detonated the ammunition. But the Sherman had survived. Whether the sandbags had actually disrupted the penetrator, or whether the round had struck at an unfavorable angle against the sloped armor beneath, Hoffman could not determine. The result was the same. The Sherman lived, and now it was seeking revenge. The American return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Not just the Sherman that had been hit, but all 3 visible tanks, plus at least 2 more that had apparently been concealed in the tree line, opened fire simultaneously, saturating the area around Hoffman's position with 75mm high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. The Americans were not trying to achieve precision kills. They were laying down suppressive fire, blanketing the suspected German position with explosives to force the defenders to button up and break their aim. Hoffman ordered his driver to reverse, backing the Panther into deeper cover while his gunner reloaded. The tactical situation had deteriorated exactly as he had feared. The Germans had achieved a solid hit but failed to kill the target, and now they were facing overwhelming return fire from multiple opponents. The Panther's armor held against the American rounds. The frontal plate was thick enough to resist the Sherman's 75mm gun at this range, but the volume of fire was psychologically overwhelming and tactically paralyzing. Hoffman could not effectively engage targets while being hammered by continuous impacts that shook the tank and made precise gunnery impossible. This was the fundamental problem that German armored forces faced throughout the later stages of the war. German tanks were individually superior, but American tanks were overwhelmingly numerous and tactically coordinated. A Panther could kill 3 or 4 Shermans in a well-executed ambush, but if there were 6 or 8 Shermans in the formation, the survivors would overwhelm the German position through sheer volume of fire. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could absorb losses and continue fighting. Germany, with its limited production capacity and dwindling pool of trained crews, could not afford to trade tanks even at favorable loss ratios. The Americans could and did accept losses that would have been catastrophic for German formations, knowing that replacement vehicles and crews would arrive within days. The sandbags, by providing even marginal improvements in survivability, tilted those attrition calculations slightly further in the Americans' favor. If sandbags allowed 1 Sherman in 10 to survive a hit that would otherwise have killed it, then the loss exchange ratios shifted by 10% in favor of the Americans. Small advantages, compounded over hundreds of engagements, produced strategic effects. Hoffman's crew successfully disengaged from the encounter, using smoke grenades and reverse movement to break contact and relocate to an alternate firing position. They had survived the engagement without loss, but had also failed to stop the American advance. The sandbagged Shermans continued forward, grinding through German defensive positions that were too thinly held and too poorly supplied to sustain prolonged resistance. This pattern would repeat itself across France throughout the autumn of 1944. German forces would fight skillfully and inflict casualties, but would ultimately yield ground because they lacked the resources to sustain defensive operations against an enemy that enjoyed massive material superiority.
The sandbags were a tiny part of that larger story, but they were emblematic of the broader dynamics at work. American material abundance and tactical adaptability slowly overwhelming German technical sophistication and tactical skill. The evening after the engagement, Hoffman sat with his crew in a hasty bivouac established in a forest several kilometers behind the former front line. They had received orders to withdraw further during the night, falling back to defensive positions along a river line that would supposedly offer better opportunities to channel American attacks into killing zones. The orders were tactically sound but strategically futile. Everyone understood that the river line would eventually fall just as every previous defensive line had fallen, and that the retreat would continue until they reached the German border, or until the army disintegrated entirely. The crew worked quietly on maintenance tasks, checking the Panther's suspension and tracks for damage from the day's fighting, cleaning the gun barrel, inventorying remaining ammunition. They worked with the mechanical efficiency of experienced soldiers, but there was little conversation, little of the camaraderie that had characterized earlier stages of the war. They were tired, not just physically but spiritually, worn down by the grinding reality of fighting a defensive war against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources. Schmidt, the gunner, approached Hoffman with a question that had clearly been troubling him. "Did I miss?" he asked quietly. "The sandbag Sherman, did I miss the weak points?" Hoffman considered the question carefully before responding. "You hit exactly where you aimed," he said. Whether the round penetrated, whether the sandbags disrupted it, I cannot say, but your shooting was correct. Schmidt nodded but did not look reassured. For a gunner who took pride in his marksmanship, the uncertainty was deeply unsettling. He had done everything right, had executed his training perfectly, and the target had survived. If training and skill were no longer sufficient to guarantee results, then what could be counted on? The question hung unspoken between them, unanswerable in any satisfying way. The German military had built its identity around professional competence, around the idea that superior training and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. This belief had been tested repeatedly throughout the war. In Russia, where German technical superiority had been challenged by Soviet mass production and operational depth. In North Africa, where German tactical excellence had ultimately succumbed to Allied logistical superiority. And now in France, where German defensive skill was being overwhelmed by Allied material abundance and tactical adaptability. The sandbags represented a particular kind of challenge to German military self-conception, because they suggested that even crude improvisation, when applied by a well-supplied enemy, could neutralize German advantages in equipment design and crew training. If burlap sacks full of dirt could meaningfully affect combat outcomes, then perhaps the whole edifice of German military professionalism was less important than Germans wanted to believe. Perhaps wars were ultimately won not by the best soldiers or the best equipment, but by the side that could mobilize resources most effectively and sustain operations longest. This was a deeply unwelcome conclusion for soldiers who had invested their identities in the belief that German military excellence was inherently superior to Allied material superiority. The technical debate about sandbag effectiveness continued in American military circles throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. Ordnance testing facilities in England and the United States conducted controlled experiments, firing various German weapons at sandbag armored targets to assess actual protection levels. The results were mixed and heavily dependent on specific conditions. Against Panzerfaust-shaped charge warheads, thick sandbag applications, 30 centimeters or more, could provide meaningful protection by causing premature detonation and disrupting jet formation. Against high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds from German tank guns, sandbags provided minimal protection. The projectiles simply punched through the sandbags and continued to the armor plate beneath. Against smaller-caliber anti-tank weapons and infantry anti-tank rifles, sandbags provided variable protection depending on impact angles and the specific weapon involved. The overall conclusion from these tests was that sandbag armor was most effective against shaped charge weapons at close range, provided marginal protection against medium-caliber kinetic penetrators, and was essentially useless against large-caliber tank guns. But the tests also confirmed what field experience had already suggested, that even marginal protection was valuable, that the psychological benefits were real, and that the modification should be permitted if not actively encouraged. The American military's willingness to tolerate and even study improvised field modifications stood in stark contrast to the German approach, which emphasized standardization and adherence to approved designs. This difference reflected deeper cultural and organizational differences between the two militaries. The American military, drawn from a civilian society that valued individual initiative and practical problem-solving, was relatively comfortable with improvisation and deviation from standard procedures when circumstances demanded it. Officers were trained to accomplish mission objectives rather than to follow rigid procedures, and soldiers were expected to use their judgment and adapt to circumstances. The German military, rooted in a tradition that emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and adherence to doctrine, was less comfortable with deviation from approved methods. This rigidity had advantages. It produced highly predictable and coordinated operations when circumstances matched doctrinal assumptions, but it also created brittleness, an inability to adapt when circumstances deviated from what doctrine anticipated. The sandbags were a small example of a larger pattern. Americans adapted constantly at every level of their military organization, while Germans adapted more slowly and primarily through official channels that could not respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. By November 1944, as Allied forces closed on the German border and prepared for the winter campaign, the sandbag modification had become so common that it was being incorporated into official field manuals and maintenance guidance. Crews were advised on proper application techniques. Distribute weight evenly to minimize suspension stress, secure bags firmly to prevent them from shifting during movement, remove bags before extended road marches to reduce mechanical wear, reapply before entering combat zones. The modifications were no longer viewed as unauthorized improvisation, but as standard field practice, incorporated into the institutional knowledge base of the American armored force. This institutionalization of what had begun as crew-level initiative was characteristic of the American military's ability to learn from experience and incorporate lessons into doctrine rapidly. German forces, by contrast, were still fighting largely according to doctrines developed in 1941 and 1942, modified only slowly through official channels that could not keep pace with the rapidly evolving tactical environment. The sandbags themselves, those simple burlap sacks filled with earth, became a recurring symbol in American tanker culture, representing the resourcefulness and adaptability that Americans believed characterized their approach to warfare. Veterans would remember them decades later, would tell stories about particular modifications or particular engagements where sandbags had saved lives or failed to provide protection. The bags appeared in wartime photographs, in documentary footage, in official histories. They became, in a sense, iconic. Not because they were militarily decisive in the way that aircraft carriers or strategic bombing were decisive, but because they represented something essential about how Americans fought. Pragmatically, adaptively, with a willingness to try anything that might work and abandon anything that did not. The contrast with German rigidity and doctrinal orthodoxy was stark, and in the minds of American soldiers, explanatory. Americans won, they believed, not because they were better soldiers individually. German soldiers were often superbly trained and fiercely determined, but because the American system was more flexible, more adaptive, more capable of learning and adjusting. Hoffman would survive the war, would be captured by American forces in April 1945 during the final collapse of German resistance in Bavaria, and would spend 2 years in a prisoner of war camp before being repatriated to what would become West Germany. In his later years, he would occasionally speak to military historians about his experiences, and he would always remember those sandbagged Shermans he had encountered in September 1944. "We thought at first that they were desperate," he would recall in one interview conducted in the 1970s. "We thought the sandbags showed that American tanks were so badly armored that crews were resorting to primitive measures to protect themselves. And this was partly true. The Sherman was under-armored by our standards. But what we failed to understand at the time was that this improvisation was a form of strength, not weakness. The Americans were not bound by doctrine or regulations in the way we were. If something did not work, they changed it. If a crew had an idea that might improve survivability, they tried it. And their officers and their system supported this kind of initiative rather than suppressing it. This made them more adaptable than we were, and in a long war, adaptability is more valuable than perfection." The observation was perceptive and touched on something fundamental about the different military cultures that had clashed in Western Europe in 1944 and 1945. The German military had pursued excellence through standardization, through the creation of doctrine that prescribed optimal responses to tactical situations, through training that produced soldiers who could execute complex maneuvers with precision. This approach worked brilliantly when circumstances matched doctrinal assumptions and when resources were adequate to support doctrinal requirements. But when circumstances deviated from what doctrine anticipated, as they increasingly did by late 1944, the German system struggled to adapt. The American military, by contrast, had pursued effectiveness through flexibility, through encouraging initiative at all levels, through accepting imperfect solutions that could be implemented immediately, rather than waiting for perfect solutions. This approach sometimes produced waste and inefficiency, sometimes resulted in poorly conceived modifications that caused more problems than they solved. But it also produced a military organization that learned rapidly, that incorporated lessons from field experience almost in real time, that adapted to changing circumstances faster than its opponents could counter-adapt. The sandbags were not, in any objective sense, a revolutionary military innovation. They did not change the fundamental balance of armored warfare in the way that new gun designs or armor metallurgy might have. But they were significant as a symbol and as evidence of a broader organizational philosophy that gave the American military important advantages despite German superiority in specific technical domains. The bags represented the democratization of tactical decision-making, the idea that the soldiers actually doing the fighting might have insights worth incorporating into military practice. They represented the American military's willingness to tolerate apparent disorder and non-uniformity in pursuit of effectiveness. And they represented the material abundance that allowed Americans to experiment with modifications that added weight and complexity to their vehicles without being constrained by resource scarcity. German soldiers, looking at those sandbagged Shermans, saw many things. They saw improvisation, which they interpreted as desperation. They saw non-standardization, which violated their sense of proper military order. They saw additional weight being added to already mediocre vehicles, which seemed to confirm German superiority in tank design. But what they were actually seeing, though few recognized it at the time, was the visible manifestation of a military system that was more adaptive, more flexible, and ultimately more effective than their own. The sandbags were not a sign of American weakness requiring compensation. They were a sign of American strength, the strength that came from having enough resources to experiment, enough organizational flexibility to permit soldier initiative, enough industrial capacity to absorb the costs of modifications that reduced mechanical reliability, and enough strategic depth to sustain operations even when individual tactical engagements were lost. The story of the sandbags is ultimately a story about two different ways of thinking about military effectiveness, about two different organizational philosophies confronting each other in mechanized combat. The German approach emphasized perfection, optimization, and adherence to scientifically developed doctrine. It produced magnificently designed tanks, superbly trained crews, and tactically sophisticated operations. But it was also rigid, slow to adapt, and ultimately unable to compete with an enemy that accepted imperfection, embraced improvisation, and adapted continuously. The American approach was messier, less elegant, less theoretically pure. But it worked. It produced armies that could sustain operations across vast distances, that could absorb horrific casualties and continue fighting, that could learn from mistakes and incorporate lessons faster than enemies could exploit them. The sandbags hanging from Sherman hulls in irregular patterns of burlap and rope were not beautiful, but they were effective, and in war, effectiveness matters more than beauty. As winter descended on Europe in late 1944, the fighting continued with increasing desperation. German forces launched their final major offensive in the Ardennes in December, temporarily disrupting Allied plans and inflicting significant casualties. American forces absorbed the blow, reorganized, and counterattacked with overwhelming force, destroying the last major German armored reserves in the process. Throughout these operations, sandbag-armored Shermans continued to fight, continued to provide what protection they could to their crews, continued to symbolize the pragmatic adaptability that characterized the American war effort. The modification would gradually disappear after the war as tanks returned to peacetime configurations, and as lessons learned were incorporated into new vehicle designs with improved armor. But for the soldiers who fought in Europe in 1944 and 1945, the sandbags remained a vivid memory, a reminder of the improvisation and resourcefulness that had characterized their experience of combat, and a symbol of the broader organizational culture that had ultimately produced victory. The bags themselves were nothing special, common military equipment available by the millions, used for fortifications and flood control and 1,000 other purposes. Burlap fabric woven from jute fibers, cheap and disposable, filled with whatever earth or sand happened to be available. But in the hands of soldiers fighting for survival, those simple sacks became something more. They became hope that survival was not entirely a matter of luck, that soldiers could take action to improve their own odds, that they were not simply passive victims of German firepower. They became evidence of agency, of the human capacity to adapt and improvise in the face of lethal challenges. And they became symbols of a particular kind of military culture, one that valued practical effectiveness over theoretical perfection, one that empowered individual soldiers to contribute to their own survival and their unit's success, one that reflected the broader values of the democratic society that had produced it. Years later, historians would debate the material significance of sandbag armor modifications. Some would argue that the protection was largely illusory, that the psychological benefits outweighed any actual defensive improvement, that the modifications were ultimately a costly distraction that reduced mechanical reliability without meaningfully improving survivability. Others would point to specific instances where sandbags appeared to have saved crews by disrupting shaped charge weapons, would cite the strong belief among veterans that the modifications mattered, would argue that even marginal improvements in survivability were worthwhile given the stakes involved. The debate would remain unresolved because the evidence was inherently ambiguous. Battlefield conditions were too chaotic, too variable, to permit definitive conclusions about the effectiveness of any single modification. What was clear was that soldiers believed the sandbags helped, and that belief itself had tactical significance through its effects on morale and behavior. But the deeper significance of the sandbag story lay not in the question of whether the bags actually worked, but in what they revealed about organizational culture and military effectiveness. The German military in 1944 was still, in many ways, the finest fighting force in the world on a soldier-for-soldier basis. German training was excellent, German equipment was often superior, German tactical doctrine was sophisticated and battle-tested, but the German military was also increasingly rigid, increasingly unable to adapt to circumstances that deviated from doctrinal norms, increasingly constrained by resource shortages that limited flexibility and forced conservative tactical choices. The American military was less polished, less perfectly trained, often equipped with vehicles and weapons that were adequate rather than excellent. But the American military was also flexible, adaptive, willing to learn from experience, and backed by industrial and logistical resources that allowed continuous experimentation and rapid incorporation of successful innovations. These organizational characteristics, more than any specific weapon system or tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the campaign in Western Europe. The sandbags hanging from Sherman hulls in loose, irregular patterns, their burlap surfaces stained with mud and oil and cordite residue, were not elegant. They would never be featured in propaganda posters or recruitment materials. They would not be celebrated as wonder weapons or revolutionary innovations, but they represented something more important than elegance or revolutionary innovation. They represented the practical, unglamorous, continuous process of adaptation that allowed the American military to maintain effectiveness despite facing an enemy that was often tactically superior in individual engagements. They represented the democratization of military innovation, the idea that good ideas could come from anywhere, from privates and sergeants as well as from generals and engineers. They represented the material abundance that gave Americans the luxury of experimentation, the ability to try multiple approaches simultaneously and accept the costs of failed experiments. And they represented, in their simple, humble way, the values of the society that produced them. Pragmatic, flexible, individualistic, willing to bend rules to achieve results, fundamentally optimistic about the human capacity to solve problems through ingenuity and effort. German tank crews, watching those sandbagged Shermans advance across the battlefields of France and Germany in 1944 and 1945, saw opponents who refused to accept defeat, who refused to acknowledge the supposed superiority of German arms, who simply kept coming no matter how many were destroyed. The sandbags were part of that refusal, were visible evidence that American soldiers would not passively accept vulnerability, but would do whatever they could to improve their chances. This determination, multiplied across millions of soldiers and supported by unmatched industrial capacity, proved unstoppable. Not because Americans fought better than Germans in any absolute sense, individual engagements were often won by German forces, but because the American system could sustain losses, learn from mistakes, adapt to circumstances, and continue operations with a persistence that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. The war in Europe would end in May 1945 with German surrender, with Allied forces occupying Germany and beginning the long process of reconstruction and denazification. The Sherman tanks that had carried their sandbag armor across France and into Germany would be decommissioned, some scrapped, some retained for occupation duties or transferred to Allied nations. The sandbags themselves would be removed, the burlap rotting away or being repurposed for other uses, the sand and earth returning to the ground from which it had been taken. But the lesson remained, inscribed not on any memorial, but in the institutional memory of military organizations that studied the war and tried to extract lessons for future conflicts. Adaptability mattered. Soldier initiative mattered. The ability to learn from experience and incorporate lessons rapidly mattered. Material abundance, properly employed, mattered. And sometimes the simplest solutions, bags of dirt lashed to tank hulls with rope, mattered more than sophisticated engineering or elegant doctrine. In the end, the story of the sandbags is a story about the nature of military effectiveness in industrial warfare, about the relationship between individual soldiers and vast organizational systems, about the ways that material resources interact with tactical adaptation to produce strategic outcomes. It is a story that reminds us that wars are not won by weapons alone or by doctrine alone or by the courage and skill of individual soldiers alone. Wars are won by entire societies, by industrial capacity, by organizational culture, by the ability to mobilize resources and sustain operations over time, by the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances and incorporate lessons from experience. The sandbags, those humble sacks of earth and burlap, represented all of this in microcosm. They were the visible, tangible manifestation of American material abundance, organizational flexibility, and pragmatic adaptability. They were democracy and capitalism made visible on the battlefield. Not perfect, not elegant, but effective. Effective enough to carry tired tank crews through minefields and ambushes, through towns and forests, across rivers and into Germany itself. Effective enough to help win a war. And that, in the end, was what mattered.